Palestine is something that is extremely close to my heart, and it's something that I've been campaigning on for probably the most part of my life, from my teenage years. And every time I've been doing something, whether it's a demonstration, whether it's distributing literature, fundraising, I always feel that it's not enough, and I always ask Allah to create a way that you can do more, because it is the blessed land, and it's something that is key to our it's in the Quran, it's mentioned Masjid al-Aqsa, and it's something so central to the Ummah that I always want to, and every Muslim should strive to want to do something to liberate that land. And alhamdulillah, it's when Cage came to me and asked me to take on this litigation, for me it was an answer to a dua that I'd been making, that Allah had given me an opportunity to do something which was different from the usual demonstrating and protesting. So I seized it with both hands. I didn't think about the merits, how difficult it's going to be, the challenges that came, whether it was a good case, probably naively and in breach of all legal duties, but I just wanted to take the challenge on. And essentially what we saw, as the Muslim said, was children were being reprimanded for literally acting in empathy with Palestinian children who were being butchered on a daily basis. And what were they doing? Holding up flags, wearing symbols, asking for assemblies, attending protests, holding Free Palestine banners. Very, very ordinary, mundane things. And let's remember, this is before Ukraine. So now schools are used to it. We see schools calling for banners and flags, but this was a pre-Ukraine period. And these children were reprimanded, and many of them came to Cage seeking their assistance. And Cage did what Cage does. It advocated on their behalf with the schools. It put out a report highlighting the issues that had been happening. But there needed something more to happen. Because as long as this policy is in place, then there's going to be a problem going forward. Because after all of these incidents were happening, the then Education Secretary issued this directive to all the schools in the country, saying that because of rising anti-Semitism, because of this issue, equating any solidarity with Palestine with anti-Semitism, schools can no longer work with any organization that publicly rejects Israel's right to exist. Now, for me and you, that might be a theoretical issue. Okay, it's a political issue, Israel's right to exist. It's another issue that Muslims have to deal with. For people like Yahya, this is essentially conceding that what happened in 1948 and in the years preceding that, land was stolen, occupied, colonized, and carries on today, and we are going to accept that. That's what it says to a Palestinian. And at the time when Cage instructed me, my first question really was, this isn't Cage's remit. Where are all the Palestinian groups? Where is the Palestine Solidarity Campaign? Where is Friends of Al-Aqsa? Where's all the other fantastic groups out there should be bringing this challenge? And I personally spoke with them as well, because as Muslim said, this isn't technically Cage remit. But a lot of them were not willing to come forward and take this challenge on. And Cage, I remember it because it was crazy time. It was like coming up to the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And there was so much going on with the Guantanamo anniversary coming. So much work was happening. But Cage felt there was a duty that these dozens of these children who've come to us for support, we have to do something for them. We can't just let it fly. And so they instruct us to take this challenge and say that this was a breach, this was unlawful for the Secretary of State to impose the government's political view on schools and force them to indoctrinate children in this way. So what did we say? We had to issue proceedings in the High Court, and our grounds were essentially three. That by forcing these schools to adopt the government's version of events, that Israel has a right to exist, that the government was indoctrinating school children and forcing schools to do that. They're not allowed to do that under the Education Act. What they have to do is they have to present both sides of the argument, present balanced views. Even if they fundamentally disagree with the other view, they still have to at least explain it without demonizing it. What they're doing here was, if you accept Israel's right to exist. This is the norm. This is correct. If you reject it, not only is it wrong, it is anti-Semitic. So you're demonizing anyone who holds that view. And what's the net effect of that? Nobody's going to say it. If I'm told as a school child that our school is not working with this organization because they publicly reject Israel's right to exist because they're anti-Semitic, what does that do to my thinking going forward? What is that doing to my education? As I leave school, enter university, I am indoctrinated that this is an anti-Semitic view and I shouldn't hold it, because I've never heard the opposite view. So this was the first point that we said this is political indoctrination. It cannot happen. Secondly, we said this was discriminatory against Muslim students. Muslim students were facing Islamophobia, and there was no letter or instruction about protecting their rights. It's solely to protect Jewish students who had suffered anti-Semitism. And finally, we said that there would be no consultation. So the government doesn't have to consult stakeholders when they're bringing in policies like this, but if they consult one stakeholder, then it has to be across the board. They have to have a reasonable, fair consultation. What we suspected was the government consulted one stakeholder, the Board of Deputy of British Jews, and then rolled out this policy without consulting any of the Palestinian organizations. So those were the grounds. What happened? To cut a long story short, we went to court, and by the time it got to court, the judge rejected our case, on the basis that while we had acted within the timescales, we hadn't acted promptly enough, because this issue was occurring in May, and we issued proceedings within the timescale, but towards the end of the summer. And they said, well, that was the end of the summer, the protests had stopped. The protests had stopped because of the directive of the government. But that technicality was why, on paper, the case was lost. However, in reality, I'm going to tell you why this case was an extremely important case and successful for the cage, successful for the community, and successful for the Palestinian struggle. So number one, in the process of this litigation, we instructed two of the most esteemed experts in international law in the world. Professor John Dugard, who is a former UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine. He sat on the International Commission of Jurists. He's a judge in South Africa. And he wrote an opinion piece which said that there is no such thing as a legal right to exist. No one has it. And he, in his report, talked about Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa, that they were boycotted, they were not allowed to engage with the UN General Assembly, they were left out of so many international venues and meetings and conferences. Essentially, they were told, you do not have the right to exist in your current format because you are an apartheid state. And that's really, really important, because he said there is no such thing as a legal right. He said this is a political opinion, and it's a debatable issue. It's like the Kurds in Kurdistan. It's like Rhodesia. It's like Slovakia. All of these were political issues. No one had the legal right. The legal right happened if somebody is going to recognize you. That's up to them. But you don't have the right to. If I set up a country tomorrow, I don't have the legal right to claim I'm a country. If people don't like me, they can recognize me. They don't have to, though. So this was the first really, really important point. The reason that's important is that we now have these two reports, and I don't know if they've been published yet, but we plan to publish them. And they will be useful for everyone going forward as to why this whole argument about Israel's right to exist is a bogus argument. The other expert, Professor Schleim, he's actually Jewish himself, but very anti-Zionist, and he explained that this term only came into coinage after Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967. Because they wanted to try to protect their reputation and their position, they started wanting people to recognize their occupation. So that we have the right to exist. And if we didn't occupy these lands, these people were fighting back and denying us our right to exist. And like any lie, the more you repeat it, it becomes truth. It becomes the mainstream narrative. And this is exactly what happened with this right to exist. So it is high time that Palestinian campaigners fight back on this aggressively and resist it. Number two, in the midst of this case, we came to court in July this year. In February, the government published new guidance for schools on dealing with political impartiality in schools. And this was much more nuanced. It was like the letter initially was 1 page. This was an 18-page document. It identified what is a political issue, how should you teach it, how to get balanced views. And then, very, very importantly, it distinguished between someone having a political view and someone having an extreme political view. So they said you can have what they call partisan political view, where you reject Israel's right to exist, for example. But you can't have an extreme political view. And it gave 8 examples of extreme political views. And it specifically referenced the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And not one of them examples said they reject Israel's right to exist. So that for us was a victory, because this means the new guidance that schools are dealing with completely supersedes that letter that was sent to them last summer. And this is the new guidance we're dealing with. And although they did not admit it in court, I think it just makes logical sense to me anyway that this guidance was issued in response to the Cage's judicial review of their policy. Because why else would it have come out? Just 3 months, 4 months before they were meant to defend their letter in court, they suddenly published a new guidance which does away with what was being challenged in court. Number 3, the children. So these children, this is probably the most important thing for me. As these kids came vulnerable, they're young kids, they've been reprimanded, they've been referred to prevent, they've been questioned, interrogated, all for what? For showing solidarity with their Palestinian brothers and sisters. And they have no one to protect them. Parents are doing their best, but are worried about their future, their education. Teachers are scared. Other NGOs are scared. Other NGOs that other children went to were unwilling to bring the legal action which Cage did. But this was a vindication of what for those children, that they were not acting illegally, they were not acting unlawfully, they were not extremist. What they were doing was perfectly acceptable under the law. And for them, this was a victory. Even I remember at the time we said if we could get one child, rather than Cage being the main litigant, one child to personalize that experience. But out of all the dozens of kids who came, all the children may have been willing, their parents were not willing, for understandable reasons. Nobody wants the bad press, no one wants to fight with the government, with the litigation, but that's where Cage comes, like that shield to the Ummah. And that is what it is, that's what it has been for these past 20 years. It's the shield for the Ummah. That when these children, no one would listen to them, Cage was there, and they worked hard to change that policy, so that these children now, the next time Gaza kicks off, the next time they want to protest about Palestine, the next time they want to fly that flag, they can do it with full confidence that they're not going to be reprimanded as happened before. So I think there's lots more to say. I will say one thing is that these challenges are important. We are now on the cusp, really, I think, of things changing with Palestine. More and more NGOs, more and more celebrities, more and more governments are labeling Israel for what it is, a colonial, settler, apartheid state. We are hearing this term used more often than ever before. And it's only a matter of time when this gets to court that a High Court judge or a Supreme Court judge in Britain or another Western country will call them out for their apartheid. So these challenges are really important for setting that foundation. If a challenge comes in future, I encourage all of you, this had to be publicly funded, it had to be crowdfunded, and it's from your donations, your support, that it actually got as far as it did. So please, if you see these challenges in future, support it wholeheartedly. These things make a huge difference to the wider struggle. Jazakallah khair.